Hi, everybody. I'm Melinda Gallant, and I want to welcome you to another episode. Shall we call them an episode of Cape Conversations? I'm so excited today because it's with a wonderful woman who is a wealth of knowledge about folk music and about people of folk music and all kinds of wonderful things. So I want you to come along and let's have a Cape Conversation. Hi, everybody. I'm Melinda Gallant, and I am sitting here with the most fun person I know. We've had lunch. We need to do another lunch. She's interesting, she's charming, and she's a folkie, which I just love, and a product of the 60s, and it's the best thing in the whole wide world. Betsy Siggins, why did I say Higgins? Betsy Siggins Schmidt. How are you?
Morning.
Morning. How are you today?
I'm just great.
We're
just a little wet.
A little wet. I know we're in the middle of this will date this, but that's okay. We're in the middle of what they call a tropical storm, right? Jose, right?
Jose,
right. So, anyway, Betsy. So tell me, you're such an interesting person. But tell me, where do you live? You live here on
I live in Cotuit. I've been here since 1948, although I've been in other places. But we moved here in 1948. My dad worked for the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution.
Oh, you came from a scientific family.
Yeah, but I was the black sheep.
Oh.
No science in my bones.
And so you were here, you came here as a child.
48, I was 8.
Yeah.
Then you can date me. But I went away to private school. My stepmother was a concert pianist. She taught piano here in Cotuit.
Uh-huh.
And I was in the Gilbert and Sullivan group at Highfield Theater with what's the college? Oberlin College.
Right.
And so I cut my teeth at about 14 in the chorus of Gilbert and Sullivan. And of course that got me out of the house. Got me in a little bit of trouble very early in my life, but it sort of opened the door for theater and arts. So when I graduated from high school, I went to Boston University thinking I was going to be an actress.
And?
Only thinking, because my roommates were Joan Baez and 2 or 3 other folk singers. They were unknown. They'd been playing in their houses. They hadn't had any kind of careers. So Joan and I were roommates, and
go back here. You were roommates with Joan Baez.
I was.
That is so exciting.
And she was so naughty. We got into so much trouble.
Really, I can't imagine that she would be.
She has an enormously funny sense of humor. And we began skipping. We started out learning lines from scenes, and then that sort of morphed into her playing a little more guitar rather than studying lines. That morphed into her beginning to play in coffee houses in the Boston and Cambridge area.
Now, what coffee house? What was Boston like as a music scene? I mean, now people talk about Boston as being a big music scene.
It's huge. It's huge.
And it's kind of underground, though.
Well, if you're not a folkie, it's underground.
Right.
But if you are looking for folk music, there are so many venues now in the Boston and Cambridge area. So I began as a waitress in a donut shop, but it was actually a waitress in a coffee house. I loved doing it, and I met a lot of very young, enthusiastic performers who little by little said to themselves, I really want to do this. I like this. This is where I'm going to go with my life.
And so this was in the early 60s, right?
We're talking 59, 60.
Right, so it's just starting. The unrest is just starting.
Beginning.
Yes.
And there was a place in Cambridge called Club 47, which had opened in 1958-59, and it was a jazz club, and it mostly Harvard and students from colleges around came there in the evenings to listen to jazz. One day, Joan Baez, with her mom and her dad, walked through the door and said, we'd like to see if Joan could play here. And they went, folk music? What's that? Well, we now know what it is. And Joan started there, and she had 3 people in the audience. Then she had 4. Then she had 10. And pretty soon the lines went around the block. And Joan was just, that voice was startling. Tom Rush started there. The Jim Kweskin Jug Band started there. Taj Mahal was there.
Taj Mahal.
Yeah, well, yes. And my then-to-be husband, Bob Siggins, was the leader of the Charles River Valley Boys, named for the Charles River, but they were a bluegrass and old-timey band.
Oh my gosh.
And then they began playing at places like the Brandeis Folk Festival. And they began branching out, and more people became interested. Then the Newport Folk Festival, I think its first year was 58 or 59, and we were there every year for about 8 years.
Now, did you sing and play?
I didn't. There are some strange recordings of me singing harmony with a couple of friends, but it's nothing to write home about. And it's not what I wanted. I really liked the community. I liked. Back in those days, we would run an art gallery in the afternoon, brunches on Sunday with the New York Times, and we would not hire, but we would give the space to classical music students so they could practice. But it was background music, and
So you were more of a producer,
well,
promoter, producer, marketer.
a little bit of all of those things. I also worked in the kitchen, ran the art gallery. I mean,
Right.
nobody had money back in those
Right.
days, and we were like, it's embarrassing. We would only charge $1 for a membership. Well, you know
Wow.
how many artists you can pay with $1? The Club 47 ran from 1958 to 1968. And what happened during that folk revival boom was that people who were one artist, one guitar, one microphone began being groups, and it meant more money. I mean, we'd have the staple singers in there for
Wow.
5 days, but it was tough paying. The story really is the Paul Butterfield Blues Band had to play 3 shows, 5 nights a week in order to make $1,000.
Wow. Well,
And
it was the
it was
60s.
exhausting.
Yeah.
You know, there were no foundations, there were no
Right.
benefactors. I mean, we were going by the skin of our teeth and the great music.
Right.
And the education.
And what was it called though? It was
That was called Club 47,
So
because that was its
it-
street address.
I gotcha. Okay.
It
So it
then,
was a folky place to go to
Absolutely.
play. Okay.
and you could hang out there
It was
all
the
day.
beginning of something.
Yeah, I mean, there were places across the country,
Uh-huh.
Cafe Lena in Saratoga Springs, places in California. There was places in Chicago, and certainly the New York folk scene was a huge deal back then
sure.
as well.
Well, you know, all the places in New York. and
Exactly.
Greenwich Village. and-
Yeah. So, you know, we got the best of that decade.
Yeah.
And by 68, everybody was worn out. We couldn't pay the rent, and we just felt that our decade had come and it was time to move on. I moved to Washington, D.C. with my husband, who was a graduate student. He was getting his PhD in neuropharmacology.
Oh my gosh.
Now that may sound odd, but sciences and music are very
Go together.
compatible.
Yep.
So we moved to Washington, and I began working right away with a friend of mine whose name was Ralph Rinsler, who became the president or chief executive officer of the then newly formed Folk Music Festival of American Folklife on the Washington Mall.
Wow.
So I worked for him in the summers, and then he began sending me out on road trips with people like Mike Seeger, and we were taking black musicians from the Deep South to white colleges, and this is in the early 70s.
Wow.
And that was sort of the very beginning of breaking the barrier and bringing these musicians, and they were so well received on campuses that we tested the water a little more and a little more.
Right.
But those are things I'll never get back, and I'll never forget. From Washington, I moved to New York
Were
City.
you at the big March on Washington
Oh,
in
yeah.
the 60s?
Yep.
Well, Joan played there. I
Yes,
know.
indeed. Then I moved to New York City to remarry, and I had a 15-year run of running soup kitchens and food pantries
Wow.
in East Harlem, and using my music buddies to raise money.
Wonderful.
Because back in those days, they didn't have their own causes.
Right.
You know, I was able to snatch them before they were just
Well, anti-Vietnam was a huge cause for most folk singers.
I had the picture of Joan Baez in Hanoi. She went there with a peace group and got caught in the bombings. So her 3-day trip turned into a 12-day trip.
Probably very frightening, I'm sure.
Yeah, but she just has that spark where she really adjusted and adapted and was kind to Vietnamese people. I mean, it's just, her life is filled with those beautiful stories, and I'm always in admiration for her. From Washington,
Yeah,
Go
you were
ahead.
in Washington, yeah.
moved to New York.
You were in New York, you ran the soup kitchens, and
Then somebody asked me to move back to Boston, and I said, maybe it's time. So I came back in the end of 95, early 96. And Club 47 was not called Club 47 anymore. They had changed the name to Passim, Passim.
of course.
Okay.
Well, everybody's been to Passim.
Well, that's
at
true.
least once.
At least once. And they were in dire financial straits. Bob and Ray Ann Donlin were running Passim in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And he had traveled with Jack Kerouac, so he had incredible stories.
Right.
And when they opened Passim, people would come in. There was a book and card store, and musicians would go in and say, "Do you have any music?" And he would say, "No, why?" He said, "Well, you can hear the music in the walls." And enough people said that to him enough times. So he said, "Okay." So that was the era of Ellis Paul, Sean Colvin,
Oh, wow.
John Gorka, Nancy Griffith. So they kind of cut their teeth as the next
Wow.
generation of musicians, and all of them still have incredible careers and do a lot for the music scene. So I came back in 96 and tried to pull together some money and write some grants, and the next 11 years just flew by.
Funny how that happens.
It did. And but I travel a lot now for folk music. I do my archives, lectures, etc. And so I left at Passim in 2009 and immediately had all this stuff in boxes and trunks. I mean, it's the same old story for everybody.
Yeah,
Either you collect stuff or you don't. And there doesn't seem to be
You're a folky hoarder.
Oh, don't even say that again. So I took all my stuff when I left Passim, and it was sitting in my house, and I kept looking at it and thinking, there's a reason that I haven't thrown this away, other than being incredibly lazy.
And were you living in Boston or on Cape
I was
Cod?
in Boston. I was in Boston till 2010, and then moved back down here. So I had this kind of little idea that got to be a bigger idea, and I called 2 or 3 friends and I said, I've been thinking about how to archive my stuff, but what if we tried to make the next step, which would be to attract the musicians who had made the New England scene, not just Cambridge,
Right.
but all of New England's early music scenes, contra dance teachers, apple growers, people
Right.
who were in the
Right,
music business
right.
as people. Not performers so much.
Now, is it Paul Stokey who lives in Vermont?
Yes, he does.
Yeah.
He does.
So, and he was a part of all this too, right?
Yeah, but Peter, Paul, and Mary were Greenwich
New York,
Village.
right,
Yeah,
primarily.
but they're still, Paul and Peter are still playing,
Oh, I know they are.
and still wonderful, wonderful guys.
Yeah.
So I spoke with a couple of people who said, you know, a folklorist friend of mine, and she said, well, let's see what we can do with this. So 9 years ago, I started an archive, and more and more musicians are saying, well, can you take my stuff? Can you take my stuff? I said, well, I have to learn what to do with your stuff first,
Right.
but stay in touch. And in 9 years, we have just very recently signed a partnership with the University of Massachusetts Amherst in their archives, which gives us an enormous
space.
Well, it gives us enormous space, it gives us publicity, it gives us online presence, and it gives a legitimacy that I was surprised how fast it seemed. It seemed like it dragged on till that happened. And then when it happened, it felt like this is the right thing to do.
Oh, that's great.
So now we are in the process of moving all of the archives to Amherst.
Where is the archives currently?
It's in the Armory in Somerville.
I see.
We have a storage space there.
So it's just a storage space, nothing's out, nothing fancy?
Yeah, well, I do photography exhibits at Passim on and off all year.
Oh, great.
And we have a small gallery at the Somerville Armory.
I see.
But now it's the time for us to start really, doing stuff.
Right.
The other thing that I do, which I think is really, who I am today, is that I do lecture and I do workshops 5 or 6 times a year. I just came back from Nashville at the Americana Festival, where I was in a workshop about archives, folk archives. I go to the Folk Alliance, which is in Kansas City, and do so much the same thing. Newport Folk Festival, and next year Club 47 will be 60, Passim will be 50, Newport will be 50.
Oh my gosh.
So you can see we're all trying to scatter around and see what we can dream up to really honor people like Joan and Bob Dylan,
Right.
Tom Rush. I mean, there's just a lot of people who are still playing and still putting their all out here. Tom will be here next month, here at the Katuitt Center for the Arts.
He will be, that's
I
right.
think it's
I forgot all about
November, I think. And I know Lori McKenna's gonna be here.
that. Who's fabulous.
Yeah, she's just wonderful. She won Best Song of the Year in Nashville again, 3rd year in a row.
Wow.
A little housewife from Stoughton
You never know what
makes
you
it really good.
That's great. So tell me a little bit about some of the folks you knew, or you still know actually, they're still living, like the staple singers, like, and all, Bob Dylan, all of those folks. Now, Bob Dylan, I heard a rumor that you dated him at one time.
I did not date him. Take that rumor back.
All right, I'm sorry.
We
I
were
heard-
friends.
Oh, you were good friends.
Good, okay.
You were friends.
We were friends, yeah.
Okay.
He was part of that early 60s crew that were attracted not only to the New York folk scene, but to the Cambridge folk scene. And there were 2 or 3 other coffee house clubs in Boston. And there was a small circuit. And that's when Brandeis started running their folk festivals. And of course, Dylan was part of that crew.
Sure.
And the Newport crew. I was there when he went electric.
Yeah. And everybody went, oh my God, what's going to happen?
Well, some people loved it and some people didn't.
Right.
But it was.
And you personally?
I loved it. I loved everything he did back then. I mean,
Yeah.
I thought that although I don't know whether he calls it protest music, it was sort of music of the people.
Yeah. It was certainly.
And it was derivative of Woody Guthrie back in those days.
Right.
Pete Seeger was huge in our lives at that
Right.
point. But the people that I still connect with are Judy Collins, Joan, the Jim Queskin Jug Band. All of those people are still very close to us. I mean, we were a community.
Yeah.
And it's like when you meet an old friend after 30 years. It's exactly the same as when you left them,
Right.
only you have a few more gray hairs.
That's
But
true.
for me, it's been an incredible life, and I wouldn't have traded it for anything. I don't think there was anything else I could have done.
Well, and you've done it well, though.
I
That's the
have.
good news. You've done it
Yes.
really well. That's what's really exciting.
And so now raising money for the archives and attracting more participants to think about their life in music as a commodity that can be cherished and preserved and presented to the rest of to any generation.
Well, so I guess we've come to the point now where, how important is folk music? And folk music is still going on. People only think now there's rap and rock and roll and all of that.
Well,
and musical
if it's
comedy,
any indication, at the Folk Alliance Conference, which is every year in Kansas City, there were 2,500 people,
there.
all connected to folk music in some way. The Library of Congress still collects the most incredible stuff. There are places all over this country, and Folk Alliance is really dedicated to the diversity of folk music. So they reach out across the pond and around the world to keep indigenous music alive, and it's, you know, it's.
Well, I find it interesting because I grew up in the Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up with folk music, you
Sure.
know. I'm from the West Virginia hills. I grew up in Ohio,
Mm-hmm.
but Southern
Mm-hmm.
Ohio is the hill country too.
Sure.
And just across the border is West Virginia and Virginia. So a lot of that, the dulcimer sound, all of that, I grew up with that. I also, you know, grew up with, you know, Frank Sinatra too,
Sure.
and other folks. But to me, that's the music of America, and I don't think people.
It's our
understand.
history in music.
It is our history. and music.
Absolutely.
So that's why it's so important.
It is, and now with the country in such a quagmire, there is more protest music. I mean, in Vietnam, during the war, we marched, we protested, we burned our bras, we burned our draft cards.
Well, we got women to a certain height, a certain level, but we still have a long ways to go, I think.
We do. But the protest, I mean, I'm doing a thing at the Dewitt Library next month about protest music in now, sort of the history of protest music, which I diverse, but I can count people who still know protest songs from the 1600s in England,
Sure.
when people were marching and they were singing in order for the troops not to know what they were doing. They turned it into song. At Harvard University, there's a collection, I'm going to guess at this, 450 English and Irish and Scottish ballads that James Child brought over from England, and that's where people like Joan and Judy learned their earliest repertoires. They didn't write music back in the 60s.
Right.
They looked in the books and they learned the stuff they loved. And I think Joan said something like it was at least 10 years before the light bulb went off, and she said, well, I could write a song, so she did. But it was that early moments when you didn't
Sure.
have any reference points, and these libraries were the most, you know, they were the repository of the earliest of folk music that we still know today.
And so libraries are still important. aren't they?
Libraries are very important.
So if I think this is a wonderful cause, and it is a cause, and it's really a cause to keep our history alive
Absolutely.
in music,
Yep.
which to me is so important. What would I do? Would I send money? Where would I send money?
You could send money to www. Folk New England, all one word, folknewengland.org. It'll bring up our whole website, and it'll tell you how to do what you want to do.
Is there a membership thing? Could I join?
Not yet,
No,
but I
okay.
think that's next on our list, because we're pretty young as an archive,
Right.
as an organization.
Sure.
But we will have things like that. Our job right now is to transfer everything over to Amherst, to the library there, and begin going through everything. And I'm doing interviews right now with other artists because I don't want them to slip away.
Oh, sure.
And we're not young chickens anymore. All us
Sure you are.
all us old folkies are truly old folkies.
Well, now you did something in New York City this last spring, I think it was spring or winter, with Joan Baez. Was it her birthday or something?
Oh,
Was it
Joan
the-
turned 75. It's now 2 Januaries ago.
Okay.
And she did a huge concert at the Beacon Theater
That's
with
what it
all of her
was.
favorite artists.
Oh,
And
that's
it was
fabulous.
stunning. It was
Yeah.
just beautiful.
And is there a video of that somewhere? Or
Yeah, I think PBS, you can buy it.
oh, is that right?
Yep,
Oh,
yep.
great. Good.
And they run it when they're doing their pledges.
oh, sure.
So it's
sure.
often on there.
Yeah, it's probably on Netflix then, because
It
PBS
could
is
be.
on it.
Could be.
So what's up for you now going forward?
More collecting,
Mm-hmm.
more lecturing. Lecturing is kind of a dumb word for it because we don't lecture in folk music. Well, maybe they do somewhere. But we communicate across the country with different organizations that are like-minded.
You're right.
And we share. It's important that as many musicians as possible know where the resources are. And there are more than there ever were before. It's amazing to me how it's all come back again, because it died out in the 70s, and then it came back in the 90s, and then it was a little tough during the when the market crashed in 2008, it was tough on artists and organizations.
Sure.
But it's come back again. I have procrastinated, let me think, for 10 years.
That's a long procrastination.
It is. Well, this is how do I write my memoirs?
Right.
I'm so undisciplined. It's awful. But that's on the back burner, and just doing more of what I'm doing. I travel
Well, you'll have to, if you are going to write your memoirs, then you got to dispel the rumor that you dated.
I didn't say I dated. You said it.
I know. But I'm saying dispel that rumor.
I'm doing it on the camera right now. We used to travel with him. I mean, it was a
Yeah.
lot of fun.
Yeah.
My husband's group, the Charles River Valley Boys, would often play at Gertie's Folk City or the Bottom Line in New York.
Uh-huh.
And I remember one time when they were the headliners and Dylan was the second act. And he would say, let's go out into Washington Square Park and let's talk. Well, we didn't talk, he talked. And he talked and he talked.
And now he doesn't talk at all.
Well, this was 1962 or 3, and he had a lot to say about a lot of things that he still holds dear.
Yeah.
He talked about poetry and France, and it was just, I would sit there and think, wow, how does he know all that?
And he won the
'cause
Nobel
Yes.
Peace Prize.
Yeah, well, no, not peace.
No, he won the Nobel Prize for
Literature.
literature.
Yeah.
Right.
And if you
I
ever,
always think of it as peace.
right,
It's all peace.
if you read his books, of which there are 3 or 4, they're brilliant. They just are. And I have no qualms about what people say about him, don't say about him, think about him, don't think about him. He was an important touchstone for me,
Oh,
as
sure.
was and is Joan and Judy Collins. There is still an enormous amount of untouched local, regional artists who don't play for a living but play for fun, the way it used to be back in the old
Sure.
days all across this country. After work, you went to the local store and you took out a guitar or a banjo or harmonica and you played with your friends. A stunning thing for me was the Newport Folk Festival, and I'm going to say 63, 4, or 5, when they were a nonprofit and they brought in, I would say, close to 60 black blues musicians from the South and from Chicago. And at one point there were workshops. It was Peabody Park back in the old days, and there were workshops in a huge circle inside that field. You could study, you could listen to and learn something about gospel music, about old-time string bands, about skiffle bands,
What's a skiffle band?
Skiffle bands are kind of street bands. Billy
Okay.
Bragg has just written a book about skiffle bands.
Okay.
But you could meet and learn, and really we sat at the feet of these guys who had lived hard lives, and brought their music, which was their solace, to us.
That's fabulous. I mean, just to be amongst those people, seeing them then and knowing them now,
Yep.
and where their place has really come up.
Yep.
You know, I mean, there was a time when Joan Baez was not very well thought of, and I'm sure there are still some folks that don't think well of her, because she did go to Hanoi, and she did sing protest music, and she did march on Washington with everybody else, and still is doing it.
Absolutely.
Still doing it. So to me, she's a woman of conviction, and I don't think you get
Yeah.
much higher than that.
Well,
to
she
have
grew up a
convictions.
Quaker.
Yeah, yeah,
And so it was born in her bones.
right.
Her mother and father were wonderful human beings, and they lived in Belmont, Mass.
Is that right?
When her father was teaching at MIT. And so we spent a lot of time with the family. And so I
Nice.
knew both of her sisters, both who are no longer with us. And it was like family back then.
Sure,
you know.
sure. And that's kind of the theme of all of this, I think, that the folk archives is really kind of just keeping the family history all together.
Exactly.
How wonderful is that?
It is.
And your title with the Folk Archives?
Founder.
Yay!
Plain old founder.
Just plain old founder. Oh, just the founder. That's all.
Just the
And you're
founder.
it's going to go to the
University of Massachusetts in Amherst.
right?
It's the E.B. Du Bois collection.
Wow.
Which is a perfect place for us.
It is. It really
Perfect.
is. And if people want to donate to that or donate to the archives, they can do it online.
Right.
At
www.
those three W's.
folknewengland.org.
Right. folknewengland.org.
.org.
And there's also a mailing address if people want more
Oh,
information.
sure,
they can mail.
it's in
Right.
right there. And tomorrow night we're doing a benefit with Kate Taylor in Hyannis to raise money for the Houston Food Bank.
Excellent.
So no sitting still.
no sitting
it's
still.
no sitting
And so
still.
the archives are a part of that.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Well, that's terrific. Betsy, I cannot thank you enough for
Oh,
being
yes,
here.
you can.
I can keep thanking you. We got to go to lunch. That's
Okay.
it.
All right.
And then I want to talk more about who you did date.
That's going to cost you money.
Well, I'm going to buy
Lunch.
lunch. Excellent.
Make it a large
Thanks so
sandwich.
much.
You're very, very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Wasn't Betsy Siggins Schmidt terrific? Oh gosh, everything she knows about folkies is so fabulous. And we were here today at Cotuit Center for the Arts in their black box. Do it at Cotuit. There's all kinds of wonderful shows coming up here. There's Hannah in the Box in October, and in November there's Elegies for Angels, Punks, and Raging Queens. And at Christmas there's Christmas Shorts, directed by me. Oh my goodness. Anyway, I want to thank you for joining me, and come along next time and we'll have another Cape Conversation.